Tonight we are here to honor two extraordinary individuals, and I will introduce them in a little bit. Norm, who is with us, and also Sam. You know both of them. We'll talk more formally when we start. I am here as the Grim Reaper of Time because we are going to try to do three things tonight, which is a short and focused tour of the exhibition in which you will see some of the kinds of work that we're going to be discussing. We're then going to come back and sit down and then have a conversation, and then we're going to have a Q&A. So, that is why I am going to be the Grim Reaper of Time, to keep us on time and to honor the fact that you are spending the time with us tonight. So I would like to ask you to become comfortable. We're not going to be leaving this room, so if you wish to take off coats or scarves, please leave them where your seats are. But we are going to begin this evening over there at the Lanzer print, and the conversation will start there.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I'm really excited to have you all here and really excited to discuss a lot of these works in more detail. I want to start off right here with the Fay Lansner, and this is a lithograph. Now, lithography is a planographic process printing from a flat surface, and traditionally it's done on lithostones, which are a Bavarian limestone. I have an example on the side over here. It's a small one, literally just a chunk of limestone that's ground down to create a smooth surface which can be created upon. And in the simplest terms, a lithograph, think of the stone as a sponge that absorbs grease and water. And the process relies on the fact that oil and water do not mix. So created using a grease crayon, you develop your composition on the stone, and that's what will hold the ink when it is printed. So working on a size of this scale, these are some incredibly large stones that are used here. And it's built up with, I believe, at least 7 to 8 blocks. Each color would be printed on a separate block, taking care to register them in the specific position that the colors will, in fact, line up. And you can see a little bit of the overlap between some of the prints. The light cyan printed over the blue here. The blue is printed over the red. It's really interesting if you have a chance to come up and look at it. And just the way that Fay is able to bring together these beautiful shapes, geometric shapes, with the organic drawn lines. It's gorgeous, and I really love the element of almost a torn paper-like collage that she brings into her work. It's really marvelous. This is a lithograph, as I said. If anyone has any questions about a lithograph, what is it, the process, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, we're going to move on to upstairs. I have a couple other pieces I want to get to. In each of these processes that we're going to discuss, we're going to go over the lithograph as we just did. We'll do etchings, engravings, and an aquatint. And those are what all the works in this exhibition are based off of. Each one of these pieces uses one of these techniques.
Sam, do you want to point at the lithostone?
Yes. This is it right here. And so if you come over, you can see that it does have an image on there. This block is actually being loaned from Dan Weldon right now, and he did not tell me who the artist is. So we have a little bit of a mystery, but just to give you an idea. And you can see the artist created their own margins in here. They gave themselves a boundary to work within. Some artists will go directly to the edge of the stone, use the full composition. However, that makes it very difficult to print the stone without having it crack in the process. In order to print the lithostone, it needs to be completely flat across. It's relatively fragile and can be dangerous if you're halfway through an addition and suddenly the stone cracks and then you're scrambling. What do you do now?
So is the printing done, with the stone stable and not moving?
Yes, so the stone is put onto a press, and then a piece of damp paper is laid down across the top of it, and it's run through a lithograph press, which is similar to an etching press like the one we have downstairs, although instead of a roller like you see on ours, there's a bar that runs across the top, and it will scrape across the top of the stone as it goes through, transferring the image from the stone onto the paper. Yes.
You don't use any acid on the
On the lithostones, you use a slight acid. It can be as weak as just citric acid from a lemon or some type of citrus like that. Traditionally, tannic acid is used. but just something small to set the etch. And what it does is it creates a reservoir underneath the grease marks, and that will hold ink.
Are they all done that way? Because when I went to Pratt, in the Graphic Arts Center there, our lithographs were etched in muriatic acid.
There's a number of different things you can use. In the current age, people are doing a lot with gum arabic, using that as a base to use the solution. But there's a number of different ways that it can be done, and we're not limited to just limestone anymore either. People have been able to do lithographs on aluminum, on zinc, on steel. I was actually reading an article yesterday that came out in the 70s about a professor in Japan who developed a process of printing lithographs from wood blocks, which was really fascinating. But of course.
Can I just, hi, I'm Norm. It's good to be here with all of you. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize what a physical process lithography is. And also just the fact that it's extremely versatile. Like, you know, we can see in the Lancer, it's like you can get these flats and you can get this like textured mark. It really reaches across the plethora of languages. And so, you know, you can see right next door, there's, this is a combination of lithography and screen print, but the lithograph essentially kind of becomes a chameleon and becomes like the screen print, right? But you're getting the saturation of that litho ink, which is just extremely beautiful. Litho inks are just highly saturated pigments. So anyways, I don't want to take up too much time here.
No,
but
wonderfully said,
it's an awesome process, and I think all prints to me are like super drawings. I have a real drawing background, and I think of printmaking as a way of sort of accessing a staged drawing process where you're having a dialogue with the process and the material in a heightened manner. And so, anyways. I love seeing a litho stone again.
It definitely helps to bring a visual aid into it. Discussing a stone, what it is, it's tough to imagine it without actually understanding the size of the block, the stone. It's very, very heavy. It's a small litho stone, but I'd say it weighs about 25, 30 pounds or so. They are very heavy, and so when you're working with stones as large as the ones used in the Lansner, it takes a team of people just to even get it on the press and really get the operation going. We're going to move upstairs. I have 3 more prints that I want to discuss, and Sara is keeping me on track and timing. So we're going to begin with the Nanette Carter. Now, this is a relief print, and what a relief print is you are carving away what's not going to be inked up. This particular one is a woodblock print carved into a piece of wood. It's developed across 3 separate blocks, one holding red ink, one holding blue ink, and one holding a gray ink, which is very subtly printed over the top there, all printed onto black paper. To give you an example of what a relief print is, this is a block that my uncle carved about 45 years ago, which he found a couple weeks ago and he sent down to me. And so what he did is he carved out all the areas that he doesn't want to be printed, and what's raised up is what is then rolled with ink and printed onto the piece. You carve with a number of tools. I put a bunch out on the table here so you can come over and take a look if you so please. But basically, you're just scraping away the areas that you don't want to be printed. This is a woodcut, as I said. This is a lino cut. They pretty much function the same way. Nanette's piece here is really, really beautiful to me because it's printed on this black paper. And in order to achieve some of these reds up on the top and the bottom, on the first pass through the press, the red ink absorbed into the paper. It really fell into the background with the black, and it wasn't coming out. And Robert Blackburn, this was printed at the printmaking workshop, master printer Robert Blackburn said to Nanette, please print this on a piece of white paper. You're never going to get anywhere with this. This is going to be a waste of time, and Nanette would not take that for an answer. So working with master printer Kelly Driscoll, who she actually went to Pratt with when they were in school, they reprinted the red, layering it again and again on top of itself to give it this rich vibrancy where it really stands out. And if you look at the top, you can see the sheen on the red ink, and you can almost see it lift off the page. It's built up in so many layers. It's really an incredible technical feat to achieve that, and again, keeping the block registered through so many passes and layers, it's fantastic.
You said this is 3 blocks.
Yes. So there is the red, which you see here and here. There is a blue over here, and then a very subtle gray, which overlays this red square. And there's specific areas carved out in each block. You can see where the blue comes through. All of those areas, all those gaps were carved out on the red block. The gray block, there are specific areas with these lines that flow through that were carved away to allow the red come through unobstructed. The subtlety of the gray is really gorgeous because it shows the grain of the wood as she prints it. It's fantastic work. Yes? What sort of press was used? This was done most likely on an etching press. An etching press can be done to print etchings, engravings, wood blocks, lino cuts. The wood, it ranges. It can be anywhere from about 1/4 inch to, I'd say, 3/4, even up to 1 inch. You would just adjust the pressure accordingly, make sure there's enough room for it to pass through the press. Anything you'd like to add, Norm?
Sure. I mean, historically, in ukiyo-e, woodblock prints were printed by hand, right? So actually, with what's it called?
A wooden spoon or a baron, yeah.
Baron, that's right. I'm like Buren, Baron, and so with a rice paper, and so it's interesting. Actually, it's interesting thing about printmaking and its evolution is thinking about, from a kind of hand body to material relationship to the mediation of the machine, making its way in each step of the way, and not in like oh, that's terrible. Just that's interesting, how that's evolved. I mean, into digital printing today, right? And so, but one other thing that I wanted to say, I think we were nerding out on this when we were talking before, is like thinking about the way the layering happens in printmaking. And I personally suspect, it might be proven wrong by the master printer, but that this isn't really, I'm not sure that's a blue actually at all. I think it's this translucent gray that appears blue when printed on top of the black, and it appears especially cool because of it's sitting right next to that red. So all the kind of color play, I mean, I could be wrong, but I love trying to piece it together. To me, it's also like the sort of detective inspection process that is a part of it. But layering as a concept, the fact that I don't know how many passes the red had to happen. I love that story you told about, but that for printmaking is in many. It's not always about layering, but going around this room, you're going to see a lot of examples of that.
Yes.
Quick question. So
Yes.
Is like one work of art that is then divided into 3 parts.
Yes,
So
yes.
intricate.
It is, and
where to cut out that's going to match.
it takes a lot of planning and preparation, and then as well as the printer themselves being able to understand the vision and piece it all together.
So in other words, sorry, your explanation is beautiful, but I'm trying to understand. It is. This
Takes a
block
while.
up here, he would take that tool and carve that
Yes,
block,
yes.
knowing that what the web would look like.
Precisely.
And of course, what's being cut out is the non-image area.
Right. So what is that called, the process? I mean, the only
It's
thing I
a
can relate
relief
to is
process.
I used to do
It's-
batik, and that was like, what's that called, the process?
Well, it's a relief.
Yes,
It's
yeah.
called it's
Relief
relief
printing.
printing.
It's relief
Yeah.
printing.
Yeah. The other we'll talk about
gonna
soon
move-
is intaglio printing.
Yes, that is
Is
up
that
next.
the segue you need?
That is indeed. This piece right down here on the bottom right was done by Gerson Lieber, who was one of the co-founders of the Lieber collection, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This specific piece is an etching, and it combines line etch as well as aquatint. And what line etch does, it allows you to create some of these really fine drawn lines in here. And it's done by taking a plate, most likely copper, and current age that we also begin to use zinc, but taking a copper plate and covering it with a hard ground resist, just something that will resist the acid. Once it hardens on the plate, you're able to scrape in with a needle-like tool and create these images that will be exposed with bare metal. When it's put into acid, the acid will eat away at these specific areas, leaving you with a groove that will hold ink. The aquatint allows you to get some of these really rich tones that give you these effects of almost a fade, something more similar to just filling in space with a crayon or a marker. Some of these soft grays, these really deep blacks, and that's done. The aquatint is based off of the halftone process, and the halftone process is using dots to build up optical grays. The aquatint does that on a microscopic scale, thousands and thousands of tiny little dots that are going to hold ink, and it's done by taking a powdered rosin, sprinkling it over the plate, and then heating it to a point that it melds to the plate. Putting it in the acid for different amounts of time, different periods of time, will either give you a really deep, rich velvety black. If you leave it in there for, let's say, 5 to 10 minutes. Obviously, it's also dependent on the strength of the acid, but for a light gray, maybe just a minute or two. And you can also go back in with the scraper and burnisher and smooth some of the areas out to give you this fade as you go through. I have a couple tools laid out over here. This is a scraper, literally just for scraping away the burr, a burnisher, which would be used to smooth certain areas out, as well as a etching needle, which would be used to dig into the hard ground. Here's a couple of prints. I think this was the first etching I ever made, just showing the process going through, building up the plate in different stages, the final plate resting in front there to give you an idea of what the plate is, what it looks like. This was zinc. And these three tools right here are traditionally used for engraving, and they are called burins. Very similar. What was that?
Zinc is
Yes. Well, in the current age, we use zinc because it's a lot cheaper than copper. Copper prices have gotten up there, but there are some drawbacks.
But that
Zinc
nitric acid
actually-
is tough, though, man. The acids you have to use with zinc
It
is
It is very toxic.
it's more toxic than when you use copper. When you use copper, you're using an acid. It's a ferric chloride acid. It's diluted, in fact.
It's actually it's a salt. It acts the same way as an
Right.
acid, but yeah. So there are no fumes produced with that. This was done with nitric acid, but even nitric acid, we've come a long way. I mean, in the 1800s, there's a reason why a lot of printmakers didn't live past 40. Yeah, we've come a long way with different advances through the medium, but there is still a lot that's done with it. When you're working with nitric acid, if conditions will allow, you'll be working in a setup that allows you to have an acid hood where you can put it in and it'll vent all the fumes out. And obviously you wear goggles, you wear gloves, you wear a mask, you take all the precautions to make sure that you're doing this as safely as possible. There's still certain risks involved, but there have been a number of advances, most notably Dan Weldon and the solar plate, taking steps towards a green way of printing and developing works. Lastly, the last piece I want to touch upon before we go down to our conversation is the Jackson Pollock right here. This is also an intaglio work, and this is an engraving. And an engraving takes a considerable amount of force to create the lines. With an etching, you apply the hard ground and you can scrape into it. It's pretty easy to remove parts of the ground and expose the acid. With an engraving, you're physically digging into the plate. This was done on copper, and as though it looks very gestural, it looks like it's very free-flowing, and it's deceiving because, again, it takes a bit of work to actually dig into the plate and build up just through lines some of these dark blacks that you see coming through here. This piece was printed posthumously after Pollock's death. He actually developed this work working with William Stanley Hayter at Atelier 17, and it was only proofed during his lifetime. It was never meant to be sold. It was never meant to be marketed. It was proofed, and then it went into his studio. The proof was destroyed, most likely. It has never been seen again. Lee Krasner found the plates about 10 years after Pollock's death and had them editioned by Emiliano Serini in New York City. It's really a beautiful work, and it's on such fine paper. It looks like it was printed yesterday. It was done in, I believe, 1967. It's been 50 or so years, and it stands the test of time.
So copper plate.
Yes.
And then an acid.
No acid on this
No
one,
acid.
just digging straight into the plate. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing, it's interesting. So between the thing that's the same about this engraving and the etching we just looked at is that they're both intaglio processes, which means that you're printing the low ground, as opposed to a relief process that we looked at with the woodblock where you're printing the high ground. So no matter how that low ground is created, when you're inking and printing that low ground, it's called an intaglio print. Starting with litho is an interesting thing because it's neither a relief nor an intaglio print. So it is
you're
a
digging
chemical
in,
process.
The ink goes into.
Right. It's physical.
Yes.
It's low ground, high ground. And the whole conversation around that, the aquatint over there, the way that the means by which tone is created in an etching is that if you took a what's it called? Like if you looked up close at the microscope,
Yes.
if you put a microscope on it, you would see little peaks and valleys on the plate, and the valleys would be holding the ink. And I think it's such an astute observation that it is like a half tone or like a CMYK. It's like a more organic version of that, right? It's like a landscape.
Yes, yeah.
How does the ink get to the
under the pressure of an etching press.
Yes, yes. And so the paper is dampened, and then it all goes through the press, and the press puts down bone-crushing amounts of pressure. Depends on how deep the lines are, obviously, how deep the grooves are that are engraved in there or etched into, but the deeper the line, the more ink it can hold, and the darker of a tone you'll get when it prints. It's really fascinating process. And again, on your way out after we conclude the talk, I highly recommend going downstairs and just taking a look at the etching press we have downstairs and get an idea for the sheer amount of pressure that this machine can put out. It's pretty incredible.
This isn't actually engraved though, it's dry point, isn't it?
This is an engraving with dry point, so it includes both processes in there. Honestly, it's an edition of 50, and with a dry point, in my experience, even with copper, after about 15 or so impressions, that dry point is going to start to wear down. So doing an edition of 50 on this, I can't imagine that a lot of the dry point would have come through by the end. I think what we're looking at here is mostly engraving, maybe a little bit of dry point in some areas where you see a softer gray. The dry point has this quality to it where it almost has a fuzz on the line, and if you look very closely,
They might have plated it, you know, so that
true.
they could do a faithful edition, which they couldn't do back then, but
Yes.
they can do now to strengthen it so that that burr, which creates those furry tones alongside the mark, so that that doesn't fade away. Yeah.
Softer lines would have the burr.
Correct.
Yes,
Correct. Yeah.
Just taking the etching tool, the little needle over there, and using that to scrape in. Whereas an engraving with a burren, it's going to remove that entire strip of metal. It will take it completely out, leaving you with a groove. With a dry point, it will scrape into it, but it's going to leave a little bit of a burr that comes up off of the plate, and it's the burr that actually holds the ink with a dry point.
Yeah,
So
you're
it's not as sharp
displacing.
of a line.
With a dry point, you're displacing the material. With an engraving, you're literally removing the material by hand, and with etching, it's being eaten away by acid.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. But
Wait, what did you say? Did you say so you have no control? Is that what you said? Well, there's a big conversation to be had around this notion of control and art making, this notion of control and printmaking, and how that accentuates the psychology between the artist and the surface that they're working on. How much control do we need?
Right, and really, and how much control do we, sort of in the existential way to talk about it, do we really even have? So it's about really surrendering to the process, it seems to me, and allowing it to tell you, as an artist, you know, as most of us are artists here, I think it's about letting the work tell you what it wants to be, and your job is to listen and to make it happen.
You want to come preach? That was great. I said preach. You should. Here's the mic. That was great.
we're going to continue back downstairs, and we will get started.
We are incredibly lucky to have both Norm Parrish and Sam Havens here. So I think everybody knows Norm, but he is an artist, curator, and teacher based here in Sag Harbor and also in Brooklyn, New York. He has had numerous scholarships, residencies, and exhibitions. He teaches currently at the RISD, Rhode Island of Design, and he has previously taught painting and printmaking at Yale School of Art, and I think that that will be a very interesting part of this conversation. We are incredibly grateful to him for being here and very, very grateful for him being in conversation with Sam. Sam obviously has been working in printmaking for over 7 years. He has worked with numerous artists at various stages of their career. He obviously teaches here at the church, and his fan base, I think it rivals the Swifties. I'm just saying, don't cross Sam. And if you do, don't let the Sam cult know. Sam is obviously the workshop and residency manager here, which is a very, very busy job, but he does manage to do many, many different things, including his own printing practice. I would like to congratulate Sam on this exhibition. It is his first. And with that, I think that we should kick off the conversation. I would like you both just to start by talking about what was it about printing that really drew your attention to it?
That's a fantastic question. I guess I'll get started. For me personally, it's just the process of printing, just the fact that there's so many different variations that can go into it. Each way that you develop the plate, not only developing the way that you create the plate itself, but also printing. There's so many different factors, so many different variables that can go into it, and the end result is going to be drastically different across all of these. One of my favorite stories to tell people is that my professor, when I was first really diving into printmaking, she said to me, she said, there is so much that can go wrong. And printmaking takes tenacity, she said. When I was beginning as a professor, I was leading a demonstration. I went through the whole thing, building up, creating the plate, inking it, go to the press, does not print. Not a drop of ink showed up on the paper. Now going back, and she was like, well, I took all these notes. Now I can look back. Where did I go wrong? What step did this occur at that this happened here? And it's just something about having these steps, taking all these notes about it, looking back and having something that you can develop upon. If I printed it this way, what would happen if I used this viscosity ink as compared to this? If I changed this color on this plate, overprinted it with that instead of underprinting. If I tried layering here, if I changed the orientation of the plate. There's so many different levels that you can get into. What about you, Norm?
Yeah, so for me, I think it's two things. I think it's one, this notion of seriality, like working in serial. And you talked about it. What happens if, like iterative thinking, what happens if I print it like this? What happens if I print it like that? And the other thing is what we're talking about upstairs, this notion of being challenged to relinquish control or to be in dialogue with a process. And I don't think that's actually, that needs to happen, in my opinion, no matter what making process you use, but printmaking is a teacher in regards to that because it forces the issue. There's no way you can make a print and just have it go exactly as you plan. Now we're talking right now about what happens when you, the artist printer, make the print. It's interesting, you know, that I think that conversation morphs when you're talking about master printers and print shops and so on and so forth. But for me, that idea of iterative printmaking, when I was, I went to art school, but I thought I was going to be an illustrator, and then I realized I was a painter. Then I thought I was going to be a painter and realized I was a printmaker, and then a sculptor. And now I don't know what I am, but which is, you know. And by the way, you said, like, you're like, everybody knows Norm. It's like, I apologize. I know I don't know a lot of you. And to me, this is actually an informal introduction. I feel like I'm relatively new to the community, and I'm really respectful of that, and look forward to meeting many of you who I don't yet know. And so I appreciate this opportunity. But yeah, this idea of once I went to grad school at the Yale School of Art, it was like, you know, it was like this notion, those of you who've gone to grad school, or even just whenever you decided you really wanted to do something for real, that feeling of like, no, I'm gonna make the greatest thing in the world, right? And then you get in that studio, you're like, okay, time to make the greatest thing in the world. I will control this thing to wield it to become exactly what I'm envisioning, and then all will bow to it. Right? And then lo and behold, that's like totally not what happens, right? And you're miserable. And and then there's this print shop that is like sort of like, it's this like place where you can go and it's like, well, maybe just put all that aside for now, and maybe just take one element of what your grand vision was and play it out with those questions you were just talking about. What happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? It's sort of like my friend who's a great artist, Sam Messer, once said, the hardest thing you can do, you know, is to be present, right? And I think that printmaking allows you to be present in a process.
I think that's really interesting, but the one thing that I want to say is that it's really interesting for me to hear you speak of printmaking like that, because there is no instant gratification in printmaking. You can spend hours upon hours upon hours, days, weeks, months, developing your block, your plate, and you have no idea what it's actually going to look like until it's been printed. You have no idea. And so to hear you talk about it in that manner, that it takes you out of trying to create the masterpiece, it's fascinating, because I've been like, this is it. This is going to be the greatest print I've ever made. And you have no idea until it's printed. And it prints, and it is not at all what I was expecting. It's not at all what I wanted. And then it becomes a question, how can I bring this piece back? How can I resolve it? And having the plate to work back into, having that process, being able to go back and develop it through different states, that's what drives me, finding it and getting it to a place where I'm pleased with it. And having a rendition of each step along the way. As you saw upstairs, I mean, I would love to go back into that plate again. And that's something that I can do, because looking years later now, there's things that I want to add into that. It gives me that process, and I have a timestamp of each moment in there. Whereas a painting, if you continue to build upon it, layer upon it, each layer gets lost to time. Once it's painted over, it disappears. Maybe you have a picture of it, a copy of it, something like that, but not a physical original document of that exact piece.
No, it's true. I mean, I think your like emphasis on like how long it can take. It's like, in a way, printmaking is like a different mistress to each of us, right? There are different speeds that one can go about, right? And I too am one of these artists that will like spend a lot of time on something, but then once it gets to that printing, all of a sudden, even if it's a relatively slow process like with etching, and maybe it's a large plate, so it takes a long time to ink it, it's not like, oh, I have this one drawing, and I make drawings too, and it's like one shot, right? You can just basically kind of be like, oh, let me try it this way now. And I think there's something so liberating about that. Mm-hmm. And then there are also really fast processes. I know you've run some amazing workshops, monotype workshops.
Yes.
And now it can take a little while, but it's all very immediate, right?
It is. There is a sense of immediacy to it. And one quote that I really love from Heidi Herschel, who's the curatorial assistant at the MoMA, Department of Drawings and Prints, is, I don't know the quote word for word, but it's about that a monotype encompasses this sense of immediacy. The artist decides when they're going to bring this plate to the press, and that moment is captured in time. A monotype, for those of you who don't know, is a one-of-a-kind, unique impression. It can never be replicated in the exact state. And so when the artist makes that decision that this is the moment going to the press, all the marks that they've developed over the hour or so, I'm going to say no one's ever really worked on a monotype for more than a day. You really want to try and get at the press within there. But over that period of time, all of these marks, all of these compositions, brush strokes that they've laid down on the plate, they're all going to come together in the 15 seconds that it goes to run through the press. And it captures them all perfectly, freezes that moment in time, and it can never be replicated. And there's something so beautiful about that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Very passionate about monotypes.
I think one other question you're both interested in is this idea of printmaking and community.
So yeah, I think we had sort of had a little dialogue before this about, and I think, one way that I am feeling very grateful about this is meeting you, all of you, and doing the community residency, which I did this past, I guess December.
Yes, December.
It was, and it was kind of amazing because the residency, which takes place downstairs, is not automatically meant to be a print residency. I know we have alumni of that experience. This year we all printed, and we had amazing help. The community was incredible, and everybody. It's sort of like the way that the printing press becomes a kind of locus of community is truly inspiring to me. And I'm very grateful that you could make that happen. I think that I'm keen to think about ways in which print shops can sprout up, in places that don't already have them. I think this has been an important, hub. But when you think about, we were also looking at this previous show that happened at the Pollock Krasner House in 2016, which was the Women of Atelier 17. Atelier 17 was a print shop in the city, run by
William Stanley Hayter. Yes.
And I think you can talk a lot about that, but
yes.
one thing that he talked about was this idea of bringing artists of varying skill sets in and working with them without feeling like he is the master printer, quote unquote. That's the technical term for the head printer at a print shop, the quote unquote master printer. Without him feeling like he knows everything, he's relinquishing that sense of like, I know what to do, I will control this. Again, there's that word, right? But rather saying, you know, this to bring this enterprise of printmaking forward, I need to listen to everybody. I need everybody to become a part of this, and I think that was really amazing. There were a lot of printers printed there. Pollock, we looked at an example right upstairs, but also in that show, which was really amazing. You know, there were over 80 women who had robust, really interesting creative careers, art careers that worked together and forged a really wonderful and important community before this notion of feminism was sort of codified. This group of women were working together and pushing one another forward. And anyways, you know, that shop closed around 1955, and it sort of sets a kind of perfect like preamble to this show in a way.
Yeah, and I mean, Atelier 17, in my opinion, laid the groundwork for just about every studio that we have currently today in the U.S. Atelier 17 was originally founded in Paris in 1927, and Hayter moved it to New York City when World War II was drawing closer. He wanted to get out of Europe, so he brought it to New York City. Within those years, 1940 to 1955, he brought in over 200 artists, I believe. I think there were, as Norm said, over 80 women, I think upwards of 90 even. But really, going on from there, Tamarind Institute, the first master printer of Tamarind founded by June Wayne, first master printer of Tamarind trained at Atelier 17. The first master printer trained at Tamarind was Erwin Hollander. Erwin Hollander then founded Hollander Graphics in the City, who went on to train Ken Tyler, who founded Gemini Ltd., which later became Gemini Gel, then going on to found Tyler Graphics. Emiliano Serini, who printed the Pollock upstairs, trained under Erwin Hollander. And there's just this network and ecosystem of printers that transcends, and it goes down and down and down, all stemming from Atelier 17, as well as Robert Blackburn, who we did discuss earlier. Robert Blackburn had the same thing with the printmaking workshop. The printmaking workshop was in New York City, founded in 1947, and that really has its roots in community. For Robert Blackburn, he wanted to bring together artists of all age, all ethnicity, all gender, all practice, everything that he could do. He wanted people to come in and print. And so his workshop was founded on the practice that you come in, you take one class, learn how to use the press. Now it's yours. You can come by any time of day, anytime you want. You rent out hours at the press, and it was really a community-run project. And after Blackburn's death, it continues on. EFA stepped in, and they've continued his legacy, and it's a community-run print shop. And there is something about having a press and it bringing people together. Obviously, there is the reasoning that the press is very expensive and it takes up a lot of room. So if you can have a hub for it, it's a great place to be. But there's something about working with other people in a print studio and seeing everyone's works come off the press. No one is going to have the same style. Bringing them all together, having them working in the same, within the same proximity, the way that they interact with each other, the dialogue that they generate between not only themselves talking, but between their pieces. It's really, really fascinating to me.
Yeah, you know, I think that the Blackburn, it's so inspiring, the Blackburn model, the fact that that shop still runs and that it's still and it's still a kind of locus of community. I know folks who continue to print there, and I think it's interesting too that you kind of went down the sort of family tree of master printers coming from Atelier 17, and just to understand, I think some context for this, these print shops, these that sort of developed, became these super like important places where a lot of the prints you're seeing have been printed, but also prints that you know would exceed the scale of even what's in here, right? Like 4 by 8 feet prints that, you know, or even larger. You know, I was thinking about, you know, well, actually we'll get to some of the more printmakery discussions, but I think one thing in my years teaching printmaking, I taught printmaking specifically for 5 or 6 years at, 5 years at the Yale School of Art and another 5 or so years at the Yale Norfolk Summer School where I ran their print shop. And what we always said was that for a lot of the painters who would come through, sometimes they'd be struggling with their paintings in the studio, but that their prints were ahead of their paintings. They would have discoveries in their prints that would then sort of point the way forward in the paintings, and I think it has to do with what we were talking about relinquishing control and working with material, but it also, to come back to community, I suspect, has a lot to do with this idea of like, you might be sort of working away in the corner on something and really struggling in the print shop and at one table, and then at a table next to you, there's somebody you either know or don't know at all who has a completely different relationship, maybe a completely irreverent relationship with the material. Maybe they're just working fast. Maybe you're so concerned about registering all your plates properly that you're just completely like messing with yourself. But that person over there is gonna layer the hell out of a print and they don't care about the registration. And you know what? It turns out amazing, right? And you take that and you're like, you know what? Maybe I'm gonna stop caring about my registration, you know? Like, or conversely, they're looking over and being like, man, I wish I had a little bit more control in my work. Hey, what's the registration method you're using? Right, so it kind of works in both directions.
It certainly
it did for me. Yeah, at the residency earlier,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I hadn't printed in it had been in years. I didn't have access to my press or a print shop, and I was just doing sculpture and drawing work. And to get back into it, it was sort of like you're stretching. It's like calisthenics, and watching other people print.
Certainly.
It's like I wouldn't have, if I was stuck in my own studio, I never would have had that.
Mm-hmm. I always find it so liberating to see someone who has no background in the process at all and have them come in and create, because I have these parameters in mind for what can and can't be done, what should and shouldn't be done on the press. What was taught to me were very strict guidelines of this is what you need to do, this is the way it needs to be done. When you have someone that comes in that has a background in a completely different practice and they have ideas and they want to just see what happens, and I see them go through that and understanding their process as they continue, it opens up a whole new doorway for me saying, that is brilliant. I can't believe I never thought of that, because it's almost as if I had blinders on and I wasn't willing to look outside of this range that I was creating within. Have someone come in that has no specific parameters for what should be done, what shouldn't be done, what they can create, and just see them expressing themselves creatively. It's so incredible, and it inspires me every day that I work with new people. It's fascinating. And adults especially, though, they tend to hold themselves in a higher regard than, say, working with children. A lot of the times adults, because they have this background in another practice, if this print doesn't come out the same way that, let's say, if they did it as a painting, they're not going to be as happy with it. They may be excited about it, but it's, in their mind, it's not as good as some of their other work they've done. Working with children and students, anything that they make, anything that comes off the press, they are so excited, they are so ecstatic about it, and it's just such a great energy that it brings to the room, and it's really great. And a lot of the time it is replicated by, even with adults, if they come in and they don't have any background in it. And it's such a new and exciting experience. It's fantastic, and it's people of all practices, all backgrounds. The workshops that we do downstairs, we have people that come in that range from accountants to lawyers to ceramicists to sculptors to painters to draftsmen, anyone, any background, any way of life, and all coming together around the press to try something new and explore it and create it and see what can be achieved.
And so this is the Love Fest moment where I just say, you know, I think it's also about the tone that you and Susan, who I want to acknowledge is here.
Yes, my colleague Susan, the co-facilitator of the workshops that we put on. I cannot thank her enough.
Yes.
Please give her a big round of applause.
Yep. It's just so incredibly inspiring, and you were both so helpful to me in sort of re-accessing some of the things that had sort of like been there but maybe hadn't been activated in a little while. And you know, not all print shops are created equally, right? Like, so, you know, printmaking can become a really controlling thing, like a right way and wrong way thing, a moralistic thing, a this isn't how we do things here thing. And you know, what's wonderful is, I mean, there have to be some rules and methods, right? But what you both do is you say, you know what, there are several ways we can do this. And what are you interested in? Let's figure out the way that it works for you. That is special. And I think actually, you know, in some professionalized print shops, you know, it is a little bit more, this is how we do it here. You know, what is it that you want? I'll work to get what you as the artist want. It's like, you know, I prefer personally having more of a dialogue around, well, how can I change a permeability, you know? So, yeah.
It's interesting, and I do feel that that is the role of the master printer, to facilitate this exploration, to really dive into it and say, well, if this is what you're going for, these are the ways that we can achieve it. And if you have any ideas for another way that maybe I don't even know, I may not know. Everyone has their own way of looking at it. It could be something so simple that I was looking for a much more complicated way to accomplish something. And there's been times where someone comes to me with an idea and I'm like, oh man, this is going to be intense because we're going to have to go through 12 steps to get to this point. And then they say, well, what if we just did this instead? And a light bulb goes off, and I'm like, that is brilliant. Oh my goodness, yes, I'm thinking of this in way too complicated of terms. This is exactly what we're going to do. And it is that dialogue, working together to create these prints, especially on the theme of the exhibition here, the master printers working with the artists to create these works, develop these images that are the culmination of both of their efforts coming together. The technical knowledge of the printer, the artistic merit of the artists themselves, really just bringing together both sides of the practice to create something that can't be replicated in any other fashion under any other environment. It's magnificent.
I want to open it up for questions, but before I do, I have a question of my own, which is to do with the erasing of the name of the printer. I think, and I'm guilty of this as an art historian, too often I have looked at a print and I have thought about the artist and not the printer. And one of the things I admire in this exhibition, Sam, is the amount of research that you did in order to recover and recognize the printers who worked on this. But it is a shocking part of art history that we privilege one name over another.
Mm-hmm. I'm very passionate about giving credit to the printers. Being a printer myself, I know that there is an entire side of this that goes unseen. All that you see on the wall is the finished product, and especially with prints, they probably went through a multitude of renditions, multiple states before we ended up here. The printer having just as much of a role in that as anyone else. And to lose the name, it's just to document, not even for the reasons of giving credit. It doesn't need to be up on every label, everywhere, but just to understand who was involved in the making of this. And a lot of the time, as Sara said, I spent a lot of time researching and trying to figure out exactly who the printers were, because a lot of the time they aren't listed anywhere. And I had to go through, and luckily enough, I'm able to make contact with a lot of the studios that are still in existence, and I can reach out to them and say, hi, do you have any notes about this? I'm putting this exhibition together. Could you tell me a little bit more about the print? But it is the case that many of these studios cease to exist. They shut down operations. All the records that they have are lost to time. The Vicente, I cannot say for sure. That's the one in the back there with the block-colored shapes. I can't say for sure who printed that. I'm fairly certain it was Erwin Hollander, but there is no recollection of it. There's no documentation of that work. The Liechtenstein, just to the left of that, was printed at Styria Studios. Styria Studios ceased to function in 1990, and it took me a very long time to even figure out who founded it. I had the name, I was able to find the printer of the work, but who actually founded the workshop? It took another probably, I think, about 20 or so days before I was able to actually narrow that down, and just going through oral interviews with people, reading through transcripts, manuscripts, going through the person who, if this printer worked there for this period of time, let me send them an email and see if they have any insight on it. There's so much that's lost to time, and it's really a key component of the print, the printer allowing this composition to exist in the way that it does. And I would like to give as much credit as I can to the artist, but there is an equal role that's played by both parties, and I do feel that it's necessary to represent them as such.
I think that's extremely like moving, and the work that you've put in is laudable in that regard. And in a way, it's just, to me, I think there are several things that are going on that have led to this. One is this sort of mythology of the artist, right, as this lone genius, right, the brooding lone genius who does it all themselves, right? And so there's a lot that I think that sort of putting on that pedestal, you could say it's putting the artist on a pedestal, but it actually, especially for young aspiring artists, puts them in a bit of a cage, right? Because this idea that we have to do it ourselves is actually false. It actually isn't how it works at all in any context. And so it does everyone a disservice, and certainly it's marginalized printers who are also artists usually, by the way, simultaneously, right? And they're actually bringing their artistic expertise in an act of extreme generosity. Sure, they're also, it's a business, right? But that there's a lot of generosity that happens here. So you had said that you had that story about Ken Tyler,
Yes,
who you're talking about Gemini Gel and Gemini, but he also ran Tyler Graphics after all that, and I think it was might have been based in Islip or something like that.
ULAE is based over in Islip.
Oh.
Ken Tyler was in the city and then upstate, I believe. But yeah, ULAE, I would like to mention them as well. They are a really key component, and especially on Long Island. Long Island, there are two. When I think of Long Island and printers, there's two big names that come to mind. One being ULAE. Going back to Rob Blackburn for a second, Bob Blackburn was the first master printer at ULAE. So from the printmaking workshop again, goes into ULAE. From ULAE, Dan Weldon, who many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, was a printer at ULAE for a decent period of time. Also Craig Zamiello, who went on to form Two Palms, also from ULAE. So between printmaking workshop and Atelier 17, you have all these branches that extend out from there. But it really is interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that dichotomy of so wait, the story that you're going to tell about Ken Tyler is that idea that you tell it where you basically said how was it working with all these amazing artists?
So someone who recently came in told me that they are the neighbor of Ken Tyler. Ken Tyler now lives up in Maine, and they were telling me a little bit about him. And they asked him directly, they said, what was it like working with so-and-so? And he said, I have no comment. He said, it's this relationship where it's like, I worked with them. I worked with them. I'm not going to say anything about them. I respect them, even if I really loved working with them. It's just, they were a client and I was their printer. There's a professional relationship there. The relationship between the artist and printer is really interesting because sometimes it's a one-off thing where they'll come in, they'll work together for a print. Other times, and Jasper Johns, who's up on the mezzanine level up there, he worked with John Lund going over 40 years now. John Lund actually has the studio, Low Road Studio, is based on the property of Jasper Johns. John said to Lund, come move up to Connecticut with me. We're going to build a studio, and you are going to be my exclusive printer. So you have that professional relationship, and it's incredible that you have the two sides of it. Sometimes maybe it doesn't work out, but guess what? There's always another printer you can go to. Everyone's different. Not everyone is going to work this way that they need to. You need to be there to support the artist, or maybe they don't want any support. Maybe they want to do it all themselves, and they just want you to stay out of it. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Norm, but.
You mean whether the different shifting relationship between artist and printer?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, for me, I'm somebody that, I'm extremely collaborative, but I think that there's something important about being a professional, but I think that the professionalization of the artistic enterprise is also a kind of, there's a corrosion to the community. And I don't think it's like always that way. I think there are a lot of healthy relationships between printers and artists, but I think it's interesting that in contemporary practice, there's a lot of collaborative practice that's acknowledged as such. But, and I think your question points to this, Sara, which is that when it comes to the industry of printing, is really not acknowledged as a collaboration, even though it really is. And you know, I think that like, there's a complexity to the problem of that, because like there's so much work that goes into the provenance of artworks, right? And who made it, and where, and you know, but then in terms of the print shop, when we're talking about the provenance of prints, it's funny how, you know, maybe the chop is put on, right? The chop is the insignia of the print shop, right? That's put on the corner of a print that tells you where it was printed. But if, you know, sometimes those chops are hard to read, and sometimes they get ignored.
And all they do is that it highlights the studio, but the specific printer who actually took on the role of creating this work, their name is lost. And again, let's say the studio goes under. The Starry Studios chop is on the Liechtenstein, but trying to find the printer after those documents no longer exist, that was an incredible, incredible challenge.
So let's open it up to the audience. Are there... Kristen's going to bring over a microphone.
Thank you, Kristen. Sam, congratulations on this curatorial effort. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I apologize for asking this question since there's many artists here, but I liken it to the industry I'm in, which is film, and you talk about relationships. If you both were to go into a studio and you have your artwork, and there's 10 different printers there, and you gave each of them the exact same instructions, would they come out entirely different?
That's really interesting to bring that up as a point, and I mean, unless you give them specific instructions, and even then, I have a really great story on this topic. A friend of mine, Robin, who lives over in California, she was lucky enough to spend some time in Italy working with a third-generation master printer. Third generation meaning his grandfather was a master printer, his father was a master printer, he finally became a printer. Robin took a plate that she developed with them and had it printed by this master printer, and it came out beautifully, and she could not wait to get back home and edition it. And she came back home, and Robin is an incredible printmaker. She is highly regarded, very established, and she could not achieve the same results as this third-generation master printer. She brought it to a number of other master printers in California around, I believe she's in Santa Monica, around that area. Nobody could achieve these same results that this printer was able to pull off. And a lot of that comes down not to do with just the printer, but this is why it's very important to take notes. The viscosity of the ink, the type of ink, how pigmented it is, how thick it is, how stiff, how tacky. There's all these different roles and factors that come into it. Many, many variables. And again, there's a lot that can obviously go wrong, but just even the subtlest actions can have consequences for good or bad. So it's honestly, I think each print would come out a little bit different, dependent on the hand of the artist, the way that they ink it up, the way that they wipe the ink off, the way that how long they soak the paper for even. Are they all going to set it at the exact same pressure? There may be slight variations in there. It's a really interesting point.
Even the stack of paper that's used from the same mill, it's you know, if you get a different batch, there are subtle differences. So there's almost like, there's variability somewhat built in, but it is also like, I think with really skilled printers, you can get pretty, I think you can get pretty close.
Yes, yeah.
You know, if there's a proof that can be relied upon. But that idea of keeping, that notion of keeping notes, it's like really important.
It is incredibly important, especially in printmaking, because again, there are so many variables that go into it, and it was drilled into me as a student that on your working proofs being just in process, write down the pressure that you used, write down the ink. What was the ratio of wiping compound to ink? What was the stiffness on the ink? How long was the paper soaked for? What type of paper was printed on? There's so many notes, and let's say I want to go back and work into this plate again, and I want to replicate it slightly different. Maybe I want to make a monoprint of a past edition. If I don't have my notes, am I going to be able to achieve that same effect? Am I ever going to be able to do it again? Am I going to remember? Maybe not. I don't know. You hope so, but I mean, there's works I did 5 years ago that I'm like, what year did I even print this in? What did I use for this?
But like the other thing, the other thing I just want to bring up really quickly is, it's like they're two different things. One requires extreme discipline and control, and the other is about exploration and maybe honoring mistakes and chance. So when you're editioning a print, it's about regulation and control, right? And having those notes and being able to replicate, like a great batter in baseball, being able to replicate the swing, right? But when you're exploring something in the creative practice of making the print, it's a really different attitude. I mean, there are still those things of like, well, I want to get a dark tone, so I'm gonna etch this plate for 10 minutes, which is going to be different than 8 minutes or 11 minutes, right? So you have to know that. But once that practice is a little bit more in your bones, I mean, you can get really intuitive with it. I mean, I had mentioned my friend Sam Messer. His attitude, when I ran the print shop, I was just like, I would get so angry at my students for leaving their plates in the acid for too long because it would weaken the acid. But meanwhile, the head of the program is Sam Messer, and he would come in and we'd have so much fun working on our plates together in that print shop, crank the music up loud, just a great vibe, right? And he'd put his plate in the acid, and I was like, well, how long are you gonna etch that for, Sam? He's like, I think this will be a dinner and a movie etch, you know? He'd put that plate in the acid, he would leave, go get a beer at the bar. It wouldn't even be the dinner and a movie. He'd go change his plans, get a drink at the bar, then late at night be like, oh, I gotta get back and get that. And then, you know, and so he'd get these totally unexpected, incredible, what are called open bite moments when the acid just eats through the resist in larger swaths, and you get these really interesting textures, right? And you can say, oh no, I messed up my plate. Or you can say, well, this is my attitude with this process.
Other questions? Wait, here comes Talina.
Sam, with all your research, is there like a book? Or have you thought about putting all of this into a book?
That's a great question. I mean, I did a lot of research, but maybe an essay. A book, that's quite an endeavor.
No, but with the like when you were talking, I looked up Until You're 17. Never heard about it. And the first thought was New York Public Library must have files or books, or is there a book? Are there books on these master printers, or
Some of them there are, many of them there are not.
Exactly.
I mean, Emiliano Serini, who printed the Pollock, I know he ran Serini Studio in New York City. I know the day he was born. I know the day he died. There is no other information that's readily available about him, about his studio, about his practice. I don't know what years the studio was active. To print a Pollock, that had to be an incredibly, incredibly renowned studio, and yet the fact that there's no documentation of this, it's mind-blowing to me. And that's why, I feel it's so important to document these and archive the names of these printers. Otherwise, it gets lost to time. So Gemini Gel has a fantastic, fantastic archive. They have every single print that they've ever produced, going down to the exact month and day that it was done, how many blocks it was printed from. They might even have the time of day on there. But it's really interesting. Most of them do. But again, it's within their organization. I think Gemini, they become such a large player in the field of printing that they are actually backed by the, I think it's the nga.gov on their website. They have an archive for many, many different things. They have a segment on there, but many other shops, ULAE, they have their own archive, but let's say 100 years from now, if ULAE, I hope they continue on for centuries to come, but if they cease to exist, is there anyone to record these archives that they have? The notes that they have on these prints telling us how many blocks it was printed in, how many colors, who the printers were, how many inks were used, what type of paper it was printed on. This could all be lost in the blink of an eye.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is like, tenuous is the word maybe I would use. However, there are some really wonderful resources where this stuff is documented. I think the prints and drawings room at the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a great resource of scholarship on these subjects. The library at the Museum of Modern Art has, I think, for many of these print shops, kind of histories and so on and so forth. And lastly, I would say that, and specifically in relation to Atelier 17, the show that was from 2016 at the Pollock Krasner House, the curator, Christine Hale, wrote a wonderful book concerning Atelier 17 and all the women who went there. And it's, you could get it on Amazon, I think on Amazon, but also the website. There's a wonderful website that this curator put together that lists biographies of each of the women that were there, and they are really interesting, as I mentioned earlier. Yeah.
Perhaps one last question? Well, I would like to thank you for being part of our audience, and I would ask you just to help me thank Sam and Norm for their knowledge.